One of the classic characters in farce is the imposter. Whether in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, or in Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest, or even in Eddie Murphy, Dan Aykroyd's classic comedy, Trading Places. The imposter serves a key purpose: to reveal the delusions of the characters around him, to reveal the absurdity in any given situation. And nowhere was that better exemplified today than in Afghanistan, where the most senior Taliban leader engaged in the secret peace talks there, the man flown out by NATO to negotiate with the Afghan government, turned out to be an imposter, a fraud. Now, this prompts some questions. Was he acting alone, trying to get money? Was he acting as a Taliban spy or as a Pakistani spy? Could he actually still be the Taliban leader he claimed to be, as some Afghan leaders hope? Or is he just a shopkeeper from Quetta in Pakistan? Did we pay him money, as a Western diplomat claims? Or did we not, as the White House claims? Did the Afghan president actually meet with the imposter, as almost every Western newspaper reports? Or is that claim just propaganda, as Mr. Hamid Karzai himself claims? It's all very murky. The only thing that does seem to be clear and clearly illuminated by this imposter is that the situation in Afghanistan is degenerating into farce. Joining me now is someone who just got back from an extended trip to Afghanistan, meeting with Taliban commanders and officials. My colleague at The Nation, Jeremy Scahill, also author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, which is a fantastic book. Jeremy, real pleasure.
Thanks, man.
How are you?
Good.
What did you make of this story? I mean, I saw it first on your Twitter feed. To me, it was kind of, it's sort of bemusing, but also depressing. What does this say about our efforts in Afghanistan?
I'm still waiting for us to find out that this is like a Joaquin Phoenix documentary that's going to come out like in 2014, where it's like, pull the beard off, it's really Joaquin, and the whole thing is a joke. Or like James O'Keefe is going to be, we're going to hear that it was James O'Keefe in a pimp costume getting tax advice from Hamid Karzai.
This is the famous Breitbart operative.
Right, Acorn, right. Yeah. Or maybe Acorn was the Taliban imposter. They're to blame for everything. No, the reality is that this is actually a very serious issue, because I think the U.S. and the Karzai government, they're very lucky that it wasn't worse. The last time that they let someone onto a NATO base at Forward Operating Base Chapman in December of 2009, it was a double agent who blew himself up and killed more than a half a dozen CIA operatives and 2 Blackwater guys. But what I also think this says is that, look, the U.S. intelligence, the NATO intelligence, the Afghan government intelligence on the ground is horrible. If they can't even figure out who's a real Taliban leader to meet with, what does it say about the people that are being killed on a regular basis by special operations forces? Well, it says that what we heard on the ground is true, and namely that a lot of people are being killed that have no connection to the Taliban.
Is it also partly a function of the fact that the concept, the unified concept of the Taliban, that name as a category, is a lot more complicated upon closer inspection than it suggests when we read it in newspapers?
Absolutely. We met with various factions of the Taliban when we were in Afghanistan, and some of them are still loyal to Mullah Muhammad Omar. Others are members of the Haqqani network, which is backed by Pakistan and the ISI spy agency there. And then you have people that are sort of freelancers. One of the most disturbing things we heard is that Mullah Omar, the emir of the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, sent an envoy to meet with a new Taliban commander who was replacing an old-school Taliban guy, and they hacked to death Mullah Omar's envoy. These guys are a much more radical generation. So when the U.S. is killing these Taliban commanders, and we read about it every day, what the Taliban, the old-school guys, were telling us is, look, this new generation of guys, they won't negotiate with you the way that we would. We actually ran a government. You may think it was a horrible government, but we at least have some semblance of knowledge about diplomacy.
Okay, diplomacy. That seemed to be, if we're not going to win this war on the ground fighting it, if it's not fundamentally going to be a military victory, which I think it increasingly looks like it cannot be, right, then the only other option, right, is some sort of diplomatic end. And when I heard this news, the reason that it sort of upset me was that I thought, well, when I'd heard that they were meeting with Taliban leaders and there were reports, I thought, well, maybe this actually is the beginnings of something that can look like diplomacy. Right. Do you still think diplomacy is feasible? Is it the only way out? Well,
look, anyone who knows anything about Afghanistan will say there's not going to be a military solution, that the Taliban actually have a large constituency. They don't operate in a vacuum. So in order to have a political solution, you have to negotiate with the Taliban. The problem is that the Taliban people are saying, we won't negotiate with Karzai until the U.S. and NATO leave. The U.S. is saying, we're not going to bow down to the demands of the Taliban. So either one of those sides backs down, or we're going to have a continued situation where there's bloodshed. The worst case scenario could be that the U.S. creates a more radical generation of the Taliban, leaves the country having fueled a civil war, and Afghanistan lives in war in perpetuity. And I think that the bottom line here is that we have our special operations forces, the most elite, highly trained forces in the world, essentially killing farmers and mid-level commanders. Those guys, Chris, I talked to a former special forces guy today, they don't even want to be there anymore. They see it as just an unwinnable war, and they want to move on to Yemen and Somalia.
Finally, I want to just ask you, what was the biggest surprise of being there? I know you've been there before, and you were just back in country, and I'm wondering what your sort of biggest takeaway was from being on the ground there.
Well, I guess that the takeaway for me was just the sheer level of suffering of people. You know, when you take off your journalist hat and you just look as a human being at what's happening in Afghanistan, the immense poverty, the immense suffering, and so many people caught between various factions, warlords, Taliban, and our forces. And the Petraeus strategy is making it worse. And that's the sober question the Obama administration needs to look at. Is our policy in Afghanistan making America less safe? I think it actually is.
Jeremy Scahill is my colleague at The Nation. He's the author of Blackwater and a good friend. Thanks, Jeremy.
Chris.
Really
Thanks
appreciate it.